everyone, and welcome back for another episode of the ClimateReady Podcast. Today, Ingrid and I will be taking a different look on a topic we touched on in Season 1, nature-based solutions.
Hey Alex. Hello listeners. Like Alex said, we've already featured a 2-part episode on nature-based solutions last season. So if you haven't taken a listen yet, make sure to check out our episodes Rivers to the Rescue, Parts 1 and 2. Today, though, we wanted to hear about the role of natural infrastructure in reducing climate-related risks. What types of interventions can help reduce flood and drought risk? How can we support the implementation of nature-based solutions, or NBS, through financial instruments and novel business models? It seems as though NBS has become an increasingly hot topic in our water and climate circles over the past few years. However, the evidence for where and when NBS are most appropriate has really been lacking. But that's starting to change as projects aimed at measuring and valuing the impact of NBS or hybrid solutions are beginning to present us with exciting preliminary data.
When we came up with this topic, we immediately knew that we needed to bring in Dr. Elena Lopez Gunn. She's the director of a Spanish research organization, and more importantly to today's discussion, she is the lead for a large-scale EU project on the insurance value of nature. We'll hear about her ongoing work, some on-the-ground demos, and the ways they aim to operationalize a framework using nature to reduce risk.
All right, well, let's go ahead and cut to the interview, which will be followed by another unique take on climate change in today's Postcard from the Future. Don't forget to subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. Leave us your comments and reviews, and follow us on Facebook using @ClimateReady Podcast.
The ClimateReady Podcast is a product of AGWA, the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation, an informal network for water resources adaptation to climate change, focused on supporting experts, decision makers, and institutions within the water community to find common solutions for sustainable water resources management. The podcast is made possible by funding from the World Bank Group. For more on the World Bank and its role in supporting climate adaptation efforts, visit www.worldbank.org.
So today on the Climate Ready Podcast, we have the great pleasure of chatting with Dr. Elena Lopez Gunn, who is a very active AGWA collaborator and an expert around all things green infrastructure. Elena is the director of iCatalyst, a Spanish research company based in Madrid, focused on environmental issues, social innovation, and climate change adaptation and mitigation. Beyond that, Elena is also the project lead for an ongoing multi-year European Union Horizon 2020 project called Nature Insurance Value Assessment and Demonstration, or NAIAD. We're really excited to have her on the show and take a dive into today's topic around ecosystem services. Thank you so much for joining us, Elena.
Very glad to be here with you.
To get started, let's first make sure that we're all on the same page for some terminology that we'll be using throughout the episode. In last season of the show, we touched on the concept of nature-based solutions. Elena, how do you define this term, and what does it mean to you when you think of this concept?
I don't know if you're aware, but there's actually quite an interesting space still on defining nature-based solutions. The definition is still not completely closed. For example, the definition of the IUCN emphasizes very much the word of action and the fact that it always has to have some kind of environmental return. Whereas, for example, in the definition of the EU, it talks about actions which are inspired, supported, or copied from nature. One of the things that was particularly relevant for our project is that we believe that in the space that NAIAD inhabits, which is very much about looking at the role of nature in disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation, quite often is going to be about the services that nature provides, but sometimes this might actually be also going down the road of hybrid approaches, and it's understanding when are these nature-based solutions effective when you're looking at them under a kind of risk framework. So I think for us, the way we're going to proceed in NAIAD is we're going to come up with kind of like an internal working definition where we definitely believe that action is a key element. And then the main function that we're going to focus on is about the kind of risk element of these nature-based solutions. And therefore, all the other elements, like, for example, the positive impact on health, etc., would be considered co-benefits under our framework.
That's really great, Elena. And you really eloquently, I feel like, touched on the issue and demonstrated why we even asked that question in the beginning, because absolutely, depending on who you talk to, the definition is shifting, it's changing over time. So that was really helpful, I think, in framing and in the way that you put it as a very kind of action-oriented definition. For our listeners, just to maybe take a step back, natural systems can provide a wide variety of services, some that fuel our industry and our economies, but also these natural systems can aid in helping us reduce disaster risk. And so in the context of the NAIAD project, that's centered more around nature insurance value. So you mentioned just there right at the end, you tend to put an emphasis more on the risk reduction benefits of ecosystems. Could you talk more about what that means? And then in terms of co-benefits, and what's the distinction there?
I do think it matters because, for example, NAIAD is sister to another 8 EU projects. They're all EU projects focused on nature-based solutions. But I think for us, the difference is that whereas in the other EU projects, the focus is really on nature-based solutions within an ecosystem services frame. And therefore, regulation, for example, the regulation of extreme events would actually be kind of one of those services. We kind of flip it. For us, we're looking at the disaster risk reduction potential of nature, where in a way, if you have good ecosystem functions, we're trying to basically quantify to what extent are you actually reducing your risks. So for example, in this context of the RR, what I would argue is that NAIAD is very much on the framework of Sendai, which is the International Convention on Disaster Risk Reduction, which is really shifting the paradigm towards disaster risk management and particularly prevention. What NAIAD is really trying to consider is not so much looking at the damages that you would have, say, from a flood or a kind of slow onset disaster like a drought, but you're actually trying to really say, well, how would it be if I, for example, manage the catchment properly? You can then start to intervene at the landscape scale, at the territorial scale, which I think is actually one of the things that we're missing. We also know that nature-based solutions are not going to be fit for all. We really have to understand when are these solutions fit for purpose, right? And they might not be for purpose in all locations, but we actually think that it increases the kind of portfolio of solutions you could contemplate when you're looking at things like climate change or global change, like even urbanization or population growth.
In this project, you're not really just doing research for the sake of doing research. You're trying to mainstream effective solutions going forward. And often the biggest hurdle is translating the theory and the things you've learned into practice. So to accomplish this within NAIAD, you all have set up a really interesting dynamic in terms of the stakeholders that are involved. And I wanted to touch on this for just a minute. To start, who are some of the groups and partners working on the project in terms of contributing to research and implementation?
Luckily for us, we have 23 partners across 11 countries from the European Union. In those partners, we have NGOs, we have a city like Copenhagen, we have a river basin agency like the Duero in Spain, we have a small company like us, we have 2 universities like King's College or IHE Delft. We also include the French reinsurer, CCR. So I think what we all share is that we all want to walk the talk. Although it is considered a research project, we're talking about applied research where we're really going to the field, to the ground, to really have real cases with real people, where we really try to kind of stress test this scientific hypothesis.
That's a good overview on the shared vision within the core group of project partners in NAIAD. But so far we haven't really heard about this other key group of stakeholders involved. From the very outset, you all pick up this interesting dynamic by working closely with the insurance industry. Can you tell us a little bit more about that experience?
You mentioned insurance. We did an insurance survey. In the end, actually extended over the first year of the project, and I think it was a decision that really changed the project at its core, in a way of trying to understand where we fit in a sector that is very established, that is obviously the most experienced sector in terms of risk. One of the key things we learned is that you probably have to differentiate on the one hand between the insurance sector and then within the insurance sector also on the reinsurance sector. And then the other thing that we learned is that it's a heavily regulated sector. It's very different if you're in Sweden, than if you're in Germany, if you're in the UK, if you're in Spain, or if you're in Romania, because the national legal frameworks are really quite different. And therefore, when we try to implement these nature-based solutions, it's something that's going to have to be taken into account.
It sounds like it's very much been a learning experience working with the insurance sector. And based on these interactions and the feedback they've provided, either through the survey or otherwise, has that reaffirmed or changed what you see as their role within NAIAD or or even the goals of the project itself?
With the relationship with the insurance sector, I think we find that they're very active. And I think possibly the takeaway from the survey that we did is that it would be very simplistic to think that they have one role to play. I think they have different levers where I think the insurance sector could play a role. But equally at the same time, we have become probably much more humble in saying, well, in fact, we cannot really talk for the insurance sector. I think they really have to speak for themselves. What I think the role of NAIAD is much more to talk about what is the role of nature in terms of its protective value when we're talking about changing climate and changing systems. That's where I think NAIAD can actually contribute with the science.
Elena, you mentioned that the raison d'etre of NAIAD is looking at what is the role of nature, but thinking kind of more about outcomes. As I understand it, one of the main objectives of the project is to operationalize or provide a decision support framework and planning tool for helping to implement these potential nature-based solutions. Mm-hmm. I'm just wondering if you could give maybe one or two examples of how you guys are demonstrating this approach.
I think I'll quickly take you through where we are at the project. The first thing that we're trying to develop is a kind of assessment framework where you're systematic about the way you approach nature-based solutions from this kind of more risk frame. This in itself has been a strong learning. We understood that first we have to start with the physical system to really understand very, very well. And I think this is where science and good science is absolutely fundamental, because you really need to base yourself on the best available knowledge, or if you don't have it, ideally try to generate it. Then the other element that I think we incorporated is not to forget the social side. Most people often forget that ultimately if these solutions are going to be implemented is because society accepts it or in a way wants it. So this idea of incorporating the social risk perception of the population in the areas that we're looking at, we actually have had workshops now in all of our demos to first define with them. So this idea of co-design is very much at the core of NAIAD. So we didn't come and tell them, okay, your main risk is flood, your main risk is drought, your main risk is X. We actually asked them in a process where we try to incorporate most of their actors to then define what is the risks that concern them the most, and therefore what are the solutions that they would consider as more of a priority. And I think the difference at NAIAD is that as I said earlier, in that portfolio of solutions, we introduce the green solutions as part of that kind of toolbox that the stakeholders are going to be considering when they're looking at their risks. And then eventually, when the project is finished, the idea is, yes, we will generate. I think we anticipate two kind of tools. One is being developed by King's College in London. It's called an eco-actuary, which is basically like an open access NatCat model that really is trying to estimate potential of this natural capital. I think one of the things that is particularly interesting about this tool is that it operates at a relatively large scale, right? So again, we're talking about landscape scale, but we've also learned from the first year and a half of the project that that's precisely the scale at which the finance world operates. Quite often, one of the problems that we've already identified in NAIAD is a misfit between some of the solutions. Some of the nature-based solutions sometimes can be relatively small. How do you aggregate them? How do you scale them up? So I think the fact that initially you have this tool which already is identifying the potential hotspots in a way for solid natural capital investment, I think is going to be quite interesting. And then another tool that is being developed is called the IBE platform, and it's almost like a kind of decision support making tool. The vision the project has is that you might be a city planner, or you might be a renovation agency, or you might be, and then you can kind of try to imagine how these solutions would actually work in your context. But at the moment, as I said, these are in the drawing board, they're being developed as we speak.
I'm glad you brought up the concept of scale, because I think that's really important, because they all have different numbers and different groups of stakeholders involved, maybe different levels of bankability, and they'll ultimately tease out some different lessons that you can learn from them. So you mentioned earlier that you're piloting and assessing this NAIAD approach in 9 different demo sites across Europe. You're about a year and a half into the project. You're by no means done, but 2020 is getting a little bit closer. So is there a particular demo site where the ecosystem benefits of nature-based solutions are especially apparent or obvious that you wanted to touch on?
In NAIAD, I think what is interesting about the demos is that you have to look at it as a matrix almost with 3 entries. One is the scale, you're right, it's a geographical scale. So we have probably our largest demo is probably the Lower Thames, so that's a big scale. And then we even have Sparta Stadium in Rotterdam, which is a nano scale, that's very small. We're quite excited because in the case of Sparta, I think it was about a month ago, that nature-based solution is actually being implemented as we speak. And this is a very clever system to basically be able to store the water, the excess water, when you have extreme rainfall, and then be able to be used when you have periods like they're having now in Holland of low rainfall. And then, of course, the poster child of NAIAD has to be Copenhagen, because whereas in Sparta, we're talking about one nature-based solution in one football stadium, very famous football stadium. In the case of Copenhagen, they really go the full works, and we're talking probably about 140 solutions. So it's much more about a strategic plan of how do you integrate nature-based solutions with grey solutions in the context of cloudburst management. And they have already involved the insurance sector in a way, as one of the actors in the whole funding and finance of this approach to reducing the risk to the city of Copenhagen.
So those are a few examples from demos. What's a quick rundown on the process of selecting and evaluating interventions? You all don't just impose a set of decisions down on the stakeholders, correct?
With the stakeholders, we identified that they prioritize what are the nature-based solutions they want us to then go through the NAIAD process, of doing the economic valuation, which eventually means that we try to design business models around these nature-based solutions so eventually they can be self-funded. That's the natural assurance schemes. That's the final goal of the project, to find viable solutions in every way, not just, but also in the kind of funding and finance. For example, we have the case of our partners in Ljubljana, where the discussion is much more to put the natural solution on the table as one of the options, because in a way, maybe in some contexts, this is still not seen as part of the portfolio, probably through lack of knowledge or inertias or maybe lack of evidence. There could be a range of reasons. As I said, in this 3-scale matrix, we have on the one hand the geographical scale. The other one is the level of implementation. And then the other third element is the risk. So we have some demos that are looking mainly at floods. Some demos are looking mainly at droughts or water scarcity. And then the role that these solutions play is very different, actually. And I think we need to internalize this quite a lot. The nature of the risk is linked to the solution you're going to be looking for.
Yeah, I mean, that really kind of gets to the amazing complexity of this project, right? So you have so many different scales, both in terms of geographical, temporal scales, different levels of government, and those sorts of things that you're working with across the EU. And I get that, I don't know, the outcomes or the results for each case is going to be very tailored, but are there any outcomes that can be more, I guess, generally applicable on a global scale, or is the outcome just that it depends?
I think one of the things that is very important is also not to oversell. I think one of the real challenges for us is to really demonstrate when these solutions really do work, and they really can help, but also say when, no, here I really wouldn't go down this road unless you complement it with this and this and this. Because otherwise, I think we would be shooting ourselves in the foot, and then you would lose a lot of reputation. So I think, sadly, the answer is yes, it depends. But I think the dream that we have is that even if it does depend, that we can find some kind of general lessons that are applicable to different places and different locations. The idea is that these are test cases to have a deeper understanding of what really are ultimately systems. So then we do have to tailor-make them to the specific location, but we're still talking about systems. So the deeper our knowledge on how the systems work, the more likely we are that we will be able to come up with similar schemes, or that are based on a similar approach, but that are fit for purpose for particular locations. But at the same time, the more we know about, how do cities, how do nature-based solutions generally, how could they help cities in general to cope with, say, heat waves or drought, or how could they help with sea level rise? I think we will be looking at solutions, and it's not just nature. This is my point, that nature is part of the solution. I strongly believe so, and I hope that with the project we can demonstrate. But also, we need to be conscious that they need to be complemented with other elements. And it's knowing when will they work together with something else, and when will they really not work. This is a space where our knowledge is still very low. And that's why I think projects like NAIAD hopefully can help, because I think the gap is so big that the more people that work on this, the better, because the faster we will get to have a better knowledge, so we actually know how to implement these solutions or when to implement these solutions.
So as we're looking forward still, in a perfect world, when NAIAD is all wrapped up a couple of years from now, what kind of changes might we see, and what kind of changes would you like to see, maybe in terms of, for example, the way that insurers operate, or any other types of long-term benefits you might see?
So for me, one is the impact on the science, of course. We need to have much better knowledge and evidence, as you said, grounded on the best scientific knowledge on these nature-based solutions. I think the other impact that we're starting to really see is on the level of policy. For example, we're trying to now engage with the discussions around the role of green infrastructure, which is very much part of Sendai, the paradigm shift towards prevention. We're riding that wave. So to be part of that discussion and that global discussion at the moment on changing the paradigm towards prevention is very important. I think NAIAD should be very much part of the discussion. And then the third one, which to me is very much, I think, in the heart of all of us, is to see it happen in reality, not just, okay, the science is great, we need it. I am a scientist myself. The policy, yes, of course, we need to influence policy processes, but we also need to show that it works or when it doesn't work. The fact that we've done 9 is by no ways enough. We will need to kind of have some institutions that somehow vouch for going for this approach. And I think to me, it's shifting the thinking a bit. And I think I do think it is happening. So I think to us, I would hope that at the end of NAIAD, I don't need to have another 3-year research project. I would actually be able to go to someone in the region of Madrid or someone in my country and say, look, why don't you invest in flood restoration? It's very effective. Go for it. So they do actually think of this nature-based solution as very much part of the way they're going to face climate change. So to me, I would expect that in 3 years' time, I have enough evidence or simulated evidence, robust enough, that then they're willing to invest in nature.
That's like super important, just what you said right there at the end, is we're talking about shifting that paradigm response to prevention. At this point, I think it's like 90% of funding for disaster risk reduction goes toward response. And there's hardly any funding right now, going towards preventative measures, which over the long run, we know would be a lot more cost effective, save lives, save infrastructure, save nature. And so having an evidence base, and collecting these examples of how we can actually implement preventative measures that are going to work over the long term, I think will really help in terms of working on the funding.
Yeah.
And I think it's a really opportune time for NAIAD too. I think that there's a lot more kind of inertia and momentum and with that credibility behind these nature-based solutions and these types of approaches. World Water Day this past year was all about nature-based solutions, and the theme for this year's World Water Week in Stockholm is water ecosystems and human development. So I think that NAIAD will hopefully be in a very good place at its conclusion, and there will be enough momentum to take the results and keep them going in perpetuity. I think that's all the questions we had prepared. We really appreciate the time, Elena.
You're very welcome. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
We hope you all really enjoyed our in-depth conversation with Elena. I know, speaking for myself, I feel like this could have been one of those 2-hour interviews. I had about 30 more questions I would have loved to ask her because I'm so inspired by all the really interesting work that she's doing. And it was great to get an opportunity to hear about a new topic within the arena of nature-based solutions. We hear more and more about the potential and realized values of green or hybrid infrastructure, and yet we're still learning a ton as we explore and research the complexities of nature-based solutions.
Elena mentioned that the EU has put a high priority on research in this area, where NAIAD is only one of 9 or so EU-funded projects on nature-based solutions. In particular, I think there is a justifiably strong interest in looking at the risk reduction abilities of ecosystems. That's something that you can't help but think about as we turn on the news each day to hear about a new flood or hurricane or typhoon. Her research is working to find a quantifiable framework for implementing some sort of risk buffering or mitigating interventions, not to mention the adaptation components.
Oh, absolutely. But it may be equally important to remember that nature-based solutions are not a silver bullet. They're certainly not appropriate in every situation, and they can't by themselves solve all of our problems. What NAIAD hopes to do is provide the scientific evidence necessary to bring these options to the broader conversation about risk reduction, potentially leading to more investment in green and hybrid infrastructure down the road. We'll see how all this plays out with the large number of stakeholders involved, not the least of which being the insurance sector, which I think could be an interesting topic for a future Climate Ready podcast episode. Regardless of the short-term outlook, however, I'm always encouraged to hear about innovative projects like NAIAD as we prepare for a future full of more risk and more uncertainty.
As we wrap up this episode, we want to hear a little bit more about that very future you mentioned. For that, we'll turn to a brief postcard from the future, courtesy of Al Megji. Al is currently an MPA candidate in Science, Technology, and Infrastructure at Cornell University, having previously worked for the FAO and Engineers Without Borders. Let's hear his take on the future and some advice about paving the best path forward.
Dear friends, the year is 2017 and at 82 years of age, I feel like I'm 25 with the new technology. I'm writing this in my flood-protected house, although at this stage the floods have become the norm as opposed to one-off events they were back in 2018. Droughts are pretty bad too, and the food system is straining, but I have a good income and live in an advanced economy, which means that I am okay. Population control started in the UK and in most global north countries around 2055, something that's still trying to be placed into the developing world with no luck. The water systems in the world have wreaked havoc, with the intensity and location of rainfall events changing with no sign of settling down. My water is coming from a huge transfer scheme up north that I worked on for a decade or so. Speaking of which, the pension age recently went up to 90. Storms and typhoons like Sandy, Maria and Mangkhut happen pretty regularly, and the news doesn't know which stories to cover sometimes because there are so many. Governments are clinging on, claiming to be useful and relevant, but really most things are provided by private companies now. They hire families across generations. 3 of my great-grandchildren, who've just turned 4, 5 and 8, already have contracts to work at these places. Migrant policies are very strict and harsh. Sometimes it's hard to watch the news. We really failed multiple generations across multiple geographies. China's One Belt, One Road initiative was finished and used for trade for a short while, but now it's used as a global water transfer system, given the impermeable surface and constant flooding occurring along its length. The African countries banded together and became one federated country, which looks promising moving forwards. The euro is on its second try after suffering multiple setbacks with countries going bankrupt. I have to admit, a lot of the news goes over my head. We almost fixed the global food issues by intensifying agriculture in Africa and going for precision agriculture in other parts of the world. But transboundary resource issues and bickering delayed things to the point where climate change caught up with us, destroyed the soils, and ruined the infrastructure in place to harvest the crops. And because no one was in rural areas anymore, we all live in high-density cities now. It took a long time to get things up and running again. The usual human issues have endured. Wars, migration, the idea of something over there not impacting what happens over here. But there are glimmers of hope here and there, much like it was in 2018, and 2028, and 2050 now I think of it. Anyway, on to the advice. You're all capable friends. You have many skills in different areas, media, transport, marketing, engineering, the list goes on. But in 2018, if I remember correctly, you were all working in large cities of the world with projects mainly in the global north. My advice to you would be to shift your focus to Africa and Asia. We were so close to doing great things, but we just lost momentum and couldn't get over some of the hurdles in place. You guys are key. You, your friends, your colleagues are key to fixing the issue, and I send this to you in the knowledge that your breadth of experience is what is needed. Financing, infrastructure, marketing, behavioural sciences, cooperation, flexibility. This is what is needed, and it was needed around the start of the 21st century. From where I sit now, it looks like we backloaded the work. And to be honest, it wasn't intentional. We just took a route that was filled with paralysis through indecision. If only we had stopped duplicating work across organisations and focused on the contextual issues. As long as what you do is appropriate and possible, and then you build in the flexibility for future events around that. We had all the info and tech back in 2018, just the willpower failed us. Maybe it's part of the human condition. In summary, it's a mixed bag. Winners and losers, as always. Lottery numbers for the last week of August 2019 are 21, 12, 45, 34, 8, and 22. Goodbye from the future.
That's it for this episode of the Climate Ready Podcast. Thanks again to our earlier guest, Dr. Elena Lopez Gunn, and to our friend Al Megji for sharing his postcard from the future. Until next time, everyone.
ClimateReady Podcast is produced by John Matthews of the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation. It is directed and edited by Alex Moroner and Ingrid Timbo.